morning, everybody. Welcome to the First Congregational Church of Laingsburg online service. Thank you for joining us here in this digital space. My name is Olivia, and I will be your host for today. Today is the 24th week of Ordinary Time, and we are starting a new series entitled King Jesus, which leads us up to the final Sunday in Ordinary Time, Christ the King Sunday. As we explore, we have a few poems, prayers, and readings for us along the way. Blessings on this journey.
Hi, this is Peyton, and I'll be doing the call to worship today. I have been found. I kneel down and look up, with all the fallen whom your hand upholds. Morning by morning, you renew my hope, that as you draw me from the gentle folds of sleep, you'll draw me from the snares of death. I'll live to praise the one whose love upholds the universe from end to end. Each breath is praise, and when at last my soul goes forth, on my last breath you'll bring me up from death and into life with you. As on this earth you lose us from our prisons and defend the stranger and the fatherless. In death you feed the hungry, and in darkness send your light to heal our blindness. Even so, we'll know you as our kin, world without end. From Psalm 146, retold by Malcolm Gue.
We light this candle to remind us of the humanity of Christ, who lived a full human experience just like us. So we can now embrace every facet of our humanity, body, mind, and heart, as a part of our call to become like God. We light this candle to remind us of the divine nature of Christ, who overcame with love every evil we conceived, and whose resurrection proves to all the world that love overcomes evil, sin, and even death.
Well, good morning, First Congregational. This is Dr. Tom coming at you, starting a brand new series. And today is a well-known passage, usually titled The Widow's Two Mites. And you know the story. A widow comes and throws 2 coins in the offering at the temple. And Jesus praises her for this act of generosity. Now, traditionally, this passage is preached as a praise of the widow's great faith and her virtue of generosity. And is directly in opposition to the Pharisees' grand displays of pomp and circumstance, throwing large sums of money into the offering plate. Now, perhaps you've heard this passage preached kind of as a, hey, let's give sacrificially until it hurts, and we're going to fund this project or fund this ministry or increase our church's pledges. Perhaps you've heard this passage preached as maybe proportional generosity. You know, each should give according to their ability. God measures your generosity not by the amount given, but by the sacrifice there. Perhaps you've heard this passage preached as a mandate to give to a religious organization or project, or maybe even a campaign. Now, me being a pastor, I believe in the practice of generosity in supporting your local church and those communities. Can we really use this passage to teach about that, though, is my question. And I don't think so. But before we go there and explore why, let's have this passage read to us so we can properly reflect on it afterwards. So let's hear this passage and we'll go on the other side.
Good morning. Today's readings are Mark 12, verses 38 through 44. 2 stories. The first is warning against the teachers of the law. As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing gowns and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." The second story is the widow's offering. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put everything, all she had to live on."
All right, let's put this passage into a little perspective by pulling the story into a more modern context. So, what if a TV preacher convinced your grandmother to empty her small IRA, everything she saved to live on in her retirement, and then give it to his TV ministry? How are you going to feel about that? How would you advise her? I'd bet you'd probably feel a little bit angry and then start saying, "Grandma, don't do it." Right? My anger would be aimed at the television ministry, soaking up the savings from a vulnerable person. All right, now let's take it a little further, one step further. What if her local pastor then brought her up on a Sunday and praised her for her actions as a model of faith for everyone to replicate? How would you feel about that? So why do we think that Jesus is doing that here? If we read this passage all by itself, it's easy to pull that meaning out of it. But as I studied this passage in its context, in the whole narrative of Mark, I found out that this is not exactly what he's trying to say with this. When kept in the narrative context within Mark's whole narrative trajectory, there's something else happening here. And the clue to this passage's meaning is seen in the verse right before it, which is why I think it's important that the lectionary includes that verse. It says, "As he taught, Jesus said this, 'Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets.'" And then he specifically mentions they devour widows' houses. They devour widows' houses. What does that actually mean, to devour a widow's house? I started to think about that, and when was the last time that you were just like so hungry that you devoured something? Like you got home from work and you skipped lunch that day, you're really hungry, and you do that act of consuming quickly, entirely, completely the meal set before you, and then wondering if there's any more for seconds, right? When you devour your dinner, it's different than merely snacking or eating, but you hungrily and quickly and completely consume what is ever set before you because you have this strong appetite that needs to be satisfied, and quickly. So what did the Pharisees have an appetite for? Well, Jesus just said it: fame among the people, influence in the public squares, and high esteem at public functions. These appetites are almost universal among humans. Everyone seems to be subjected to them. But there's this snowball effect that happens when these things start to roll in, and then they roll and get bigger and bigger, and then that appetite becomes insatiable and cannot be quenched. Now the Pharisees have fallen into this trap, and they're going to grab the little resources left from those who have nothing to give. And as we're about to witness in this passage, that's what happens. Because how much is enough? Well, people can tell you it's always just a little bit more. So the next verse opens up with the phrase, "Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury." What's going on here? Well, Jesus sits before the temple. This is significant, but we're probably going to miss it on first glance because we don't really think much about that phrase. I did. Upon at first reading, I didn't really see that. But sitting was an act of claiming authority in this culture. Now think of a university. They have a chair of psychology or of theology. And to sit in that chair is not merely just sitting, but it's also more than being an adjunct professor. Sitting in or near the temple to teach claimed an authority that belonged only to the chief priests and elders of the great temple in Jerusalem. So this is a radical act that Jesus has done. And he's just this backwoods Galilean preacher. And then he observes the temple pilgrims who have made their way to Jerusalem for Passover. They're in the midst of their traditional offerings. This is how the temple was funded. Much like modern day tourist towns, they make all their profits during the season, and then off season things are a lot slower. The population in Jerusalem for this high time on their, religious calendar would rise from 40,000 people to like 250 to 500,000. Some people even speculate 750,000 people in the space, like land space of about 160 acres. So think modern day music festival. A lot of people in a little bit of a space, all there to have a good time. Now the wealthy are coming and they're dumping massive amounts of cash and coins and gold into the wooden boxes. And these wooden boxes had these metal horns attached to it that kind of acted as a funnel. Now the Greek word used for this action, what they threw it in, means to throw with abandon. And that made quite a noise when the coins thrown in such manner hit the metal funnel and just like rattled their way all the way down the neck into the box. And the well-to-do folks are really getting into it and making as much noise as they can. And this was all part of the holiday tradition of Passover. Everybody did it. Everyone was expected to do it. And when you have surplus in your bank accounts, you can partake and enjoy the ceremony. Now Jesus is watching all the clamor happen, but oftentimes under the radar within the systems that we have built and the routines that we have kept and expect universal partakers in this, there are oftentimes overlooked victims run over by the bus of our social expectations. When these are then religious and sanctified by organized religious groups, then we become doubly blind to their abusive ripples because we make absolute truth out of social values held to maintain our inclusion to the group and claim God has blessed this very thing, and it excludes those who can't participate. Now we're about to meet such a person in the next verse. Let's look at her now. Okay, the next verse says, "But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents." This was the Greek word destitute, and she probably would have gone totally overlooked had Jesus not brought our attention to this woman. The disciples, they certainly didn't notice her at all, nor her gift, and probably the treasurers who were have looked disdainfully at her when kind of counting it later on would have said, "What are these things doing in here? And what are these 2 coins exactly, and how much are they worth?" One of my questions. I was just curious about it. Have you ever put your 2 cents into a conversation? Like this story here is where we get that language. I don't have a whole lot to offer on the topic, but let me contribute what I can. The 2 mites here, the 2 cents, are actually 2 Roman coins called leptas, made out of like this coppery bronze mixture. And it's not worth that much. Maybe 1/128th of a day's wage. That's about 0.008%, like almost 1%. Now, if we took minimum wage today, multiplied it by 8 hours of work, we get about $80. We apply that percentage to today's wage and we get about $1.24. Not a lot of money there, right? That is the rest of her life savings. But to make this story about the gift given or even the amount there is to make the similar mistake that the culture made at the time. It's not a praise for proportional generosity. We're supposed to replicate it among us and then our churches, though we can do that act of generosity, this story is actually not about that. This is a moment of reflection for us to ask ourselves, who is excluded from us? This is not a moment to praise the generosity of the destitute widow as much as it's a lament on the culture that demanded the widow's 2 last cents left to her name to remain in good standing in the community. You have to do this, woman, in order to still be able to worship with us. Now, Jesus notes this when he calls his disciples over to him and he says the words, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others making all that racket." Now, this is not a praise of the widow's generosity as much as an acknowledgement of the great sacrifice that it is. Now, how do we know this? Jesus taught on this subject already in the Gospel of Mark that we're in chapter 7, where he goes after the Pharisees for accepting gifts to God that should have been used to support their elderly parents, therefore violating one of the 10 commandments. These gifts were not going to be used for God's purposes or even God's temple, but they're going to pad the pockets of the rich elite Sadducees and priests and Pharisees who ran the temple system and benefited lots and lots of money. So how does this passage close out? Where does it end? And what does it mean for us like 2,000 years later? That's where we're going next. All right, now to close this out, the next verse here says concerning the rich making such a clamor at the offering time. Jesus says, they all gave out of their wealth, but she, this destitute widow, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. Now the translation here in the Greek is a double emphasis at the end. She put in everything and then adds in addition her whole life, literal translation. While the rich gave much, she gave all, or everything. Now I used to imagine Jesus with a large smile on his face, like praising the act of faith on the widow's part. But if we read his statements from chapter 7, where he actually critiqued these practices back then, why would he be praising it here when back then he called it wicked? So what if Jesus said this last statement with sadness in his voice? What if he witnessed this widow's house being devoured before his very eyes, just as this passage started off with? Now, scholar and priest Father Addison Wright says this: Jesus is saying is not a penetrating insight on the measuring of gifts. It is a lament. One could easily fail to notice it, but there is the tragedy of the day. She put in her whole living. She had been taught and encouraged by religious leaders to donate as she does, and Jesus condemns the value system that motivates her action, and he condemns the people who conditioned her to do it. End quote. Now the verses right after this one that are not included in today's lectionary reveal Jesus' heart on the matter and on the temple. As the disciples are taking in the sights of Jerusalem, walking around during the holiday, they start exclaiming like, wow, look at all these buildings and how great they are. And Jesus' reply sobers them right up, and he says, I tell you the truth that all of these buildings, including the temple, are going to be thrown down and utterly destroyed. Not one brick will be left on another. So Jesus' sadness about this story is actually tied to the knowledge that the widow's offering will be wasted, and her life savings spent to pad pockets of religious manipulators who are just going to be overthrown in a few years anyways. Now that's a really depressing thought, but all is not lost and all is not hopeless, because Jesus tips the first domino of change by drawing attention to what was overlooked. The final domino is going to fall in 70 AD when Rome comes down and decimates the temple and the city for rising up in a military rebellion against them. And this was the harsher judgment that Jesus spoke of in the first verse that we looked at. And then the cross, that Jesus is headed to the crucifixion event. The cross is its own judgment of these exclusionary religious practices, because the cross is going to open the presence and action of God to all, anywhere, at any time. And it's not going to be held within the walls of a temple guarded by all these religious elites who charge exorbitant funds for services rendered. Humanity may try to place God within the protected walls of establishments, but God is never fully contained, not within our buildings, not within our programs, not within our creeds, not within our practices, because God, because of the cross, is as accessible as the air we breathe. And this is the hidden good news held within Jesus' lament of the abusive temple system. Bad kings cannot hold back the good king. Abusive kingdoms cannot overthrow the kingdom of God. Now our benediction today comes from Howard Thurman, American author, philosopher, theologian, educator, and civil rights leader. He played a leading role in many social justice movements of the 20th century, and Thurman's theology of radical nonviolence influenced and shaped a whole generation of civil rights activists, and he was actually a key mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. And I think we have so much to learn from such a voice who lived under the thumb of segregation, racism, and exclusion, especially during a series like this one, King Jesus, where we're talking about bad kings, bad kingdoms, and then eventually the good king. So let's hear this reading from his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, as a way to close out this passage today.
Jesus recognized that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of their inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to their destiny. If one knows precisely what they can do to you, or what epithet they can hurl against you in order to make you lose your temper, your equilibrium, then they can always keep you under subjection. It's a person's reaction to things that determines another's ability to exercise power over them. Christianity, as it was born in the mind of Jesus, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed. That it became, through the intervening years, a religion of the powerful and dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and life of Jesus, for he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited.
Thank you all so much for joining us online today. We hope this service was a blessing to you. What now? First, participate. If you'd like to participate in our services, we would welcome your readings with a simple phone recording. Second, partner. If you'd like to give financially to help the continuation of the online platform, there is a link at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, subscribe. You can subscribe on YouTube or like our Facebook page to stay updated on our online services. We hope you found some hope, help, and healing today. See you next week.
Mm-hmm.